June 4th, 1942. 10:22 a.m. Flight deck of the IJN Akagi, 325 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga gripped his flight roster with hands still trembling from his bombing run over Midway. Through the carrier's bridge windows, he could see the organized chaos below, Type 99 dive bombers being wheeled aside, Type 97 torpedo planes having their torpedoes switched for 800-kilogram bombs, fuel hoses snaking across the deck like steel serpents. In his pocket, a letter to his wife remained unfinished, its last line reading, "The Americans are nowhere to be found. Victory is certain." He could not know that at this exact moment American aircraft were already converging on his position. He could not know that the next 11 minutes would determine not just the fate of 4 Japanese carriers, but the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. He could not know that everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about carrier warfare, American capabilities, and their own invincibility was about to be shattered in the time it takes to drink a cup of tea. Below him on the flight deck, aircraft mechanic, Petty Officer First Class Kaname Harada worked with desperate efficiency, supervising the weapons changeover that Admiral Nagumo had ordered just minutes before. They had trained for this, switching from land attack to ship attack ordnance, but never under such pressure, never with scouts reporting conflicting information, never with the strange feeling that something was terribly wrong despite all evidence of Japanese superiority. At 10:20, the Japanese carriers had been masters of the Pacific, their aircraft preparing to destroy what they believed was the lone American carrier in the area. By 10:31, 3 of the 4 carriers would be dying, transformed into burning steel coffins by American dive bombers that seemed to materialize from empty sky. Those 11 minutes would reveal truths about modern naval warfare that neither navy fully understood until they unfolded in real time over the Pacific's endless blue canvas. The mathematics of Japanese naval superiority seemed unassailable on the morning of June 4, 1942. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier-striking force ever assembled. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. 248 aircraft manned by the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, Darwin, and Ceylon. Men who had sunk more Allied warships in 6 months than the Imperial Navy had destroyed in all previous wars combined. Against them, Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the last hastily repaired from damage that should have required 3 months to fix, made barely seaworthy in 72 hours by 1,400 workers at Pearl Harbor. The Americans had 233 aircraft, most flown by pilots who had never seen combat, many with less than 300 hours total flight time. The torpedo bomber squadrons were equipped with the TBD Devastator, an aircraft so obsolete that pilots called it the TB Dead. Captain Taijiro Aoki of the Akagi had been confident, writing in his war diary, "The American Navy is a broken force. After today, they will have no carriers in the Pacific. The war will effectively be over." This confidence was not mere bravado. The Japanese had won every carrier engagement of the war. At the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month earlier, the first carrier versus carrier battle in history, they had sunk the USS Lexington, America's second-largest carrier, while losing only the light carrier Shoho. They had raided Darwin with impunity, struck Ceylon without opposition, and operated freely from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. What the Japanese didn't know on that morning would fill volumes. They didn't know that American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had broken their JN-25 naval code. They didn't know that Admiral Nimitz had read their operation orders, knew their target was Midway, knew the composition of their force, and had positioned his carriers in ambush at Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, a veteran Zero pilot on the Kaga, would later reflect, "We operated under the assumption that surprise was ours. We believed the Americans thought we were coming for Hawaii or the Aleutians. We believed they had, at most, one operational carrier in the Pacific. Every assumption was wrong, but we didn't know we were wrong until the bombs were falling. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned Pearl Harbor, lay ill with pneumonia in his cabin aboard the Akagi. His absence from the bridge would prove critical. He alone among the Japanese commanders had advocated for keeping a permanent reserve of aircraft armed for anti-ship operations. His substitute, Commander Tamotsu Oishi, lacked both Genda's intuition and his paranoia about American carriers. The Japanese also didn't know that Yorktown was operational. Naval intelligence had confirmed she had been heavily damaged at Coral Sea, which was true. They estimated 3 months minimum for repairs, which would have been true for any Japanese shipyard. They couldn't conceive that American workers at Pearl Harbor had performed 3 months of repairs in 3 days, that welders had worked continuously while the ship was underway, that her elevators had been fixed while she sailed toward Midway. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, Admiral Nagumo had launched 7 scout planes to search for American ships. This was already a compromise. Doctrine called for dozens of scouts, but Nagumo wanted to preserve his aircraft for the strike on Midway. Each scout would fly a single line out 300 miles and back, leaving vast areas of ocean unsearched. The most critical search line, number 4 from the cruiser Tone, launched 30 minutes late due to catapult problems. This single mechanical failure would place Tone's scout plane over the American fleet at the worst possible moment for the Japanese, when their decks were empty, were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Petty Officer First Class Amari, a scout plane observer from the battleship Haruna, later testified, "We flew our assigned line seeing nothing but empty ocean. We were trained to see what we expected. Merchant ships, maybe a cruiser. Nobody was looking for American carriers because nobody believed American carriers were there." At 4:30 a.m., while it was still dark, 108 Japanese aircraft had launched for the strike on Midway. 36 Zero fighters, 36 Valdive bombers, 36 Kate torpedo bombers carrying bombs instead of torpedoes. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the strike, his aircraft carrying a radio that would soon transmit the message that would trigger the chain of fatal decisions. The Midway strike force encountered fierce resistance. American fighters, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats, were waiting at altitude, warned by radar. Anti-aircraft fire was intense and accurate. The Japanese lost 11 aircraft and had 14 heavily damaged. More importantly, Tomonaga radioed at 7 a.m. "There is need for a second attack wave." This message arrived just as Admiral Nagumo was making the most crucial decision of his career. He had held 93 aircraft in reserve, torpedo planes armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for ship attack. American B-17s from Midway were bombing his fleet from high altitude, ineffectively but forcing evasive maneuvers. Torpedo bombers from Midway had just attacked, also ineffectively, but demonstrating Midway's continued offensive capability. Commander Ryosaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu argued for maintaining the anti-ship armament. "Sir, we should keep the reserve armed for ship attack. We have heard nothing from our scouts, but that doesn't mean there are no American ships." But Nagumo, under pressure from the attacks and influenced by Tomonaga's message, made the fateful decision at 7:15 a.m. Remove torpedoes, load bombs for land attack. What followed was controlled chaos that would prove fatal. Each Type 97 Kate torpedo bomber carried either one Type 91 torpedo or one 800-kilogram land attack bomb. Switching between them required rolling the aircraft to the hangar deck via elevator, removing the torpedo using special carriages, mounting the bomb using different attachment points, adjusting the release mechanism for different ballistics, returning the aircraft to the flight deck, and refueling for a different mission profile. Aviation Ordnance Man Second Class Takeshi Maeda on the Kaga later described the scene. "We worked like demons. Torpedoes were stacked on the hangar deck because returning them to the magazine took too long. Fuel hoses were everywhere. We were refueling aircraft while changing weapons, something strictly forbidden but necessary to save time. The hangar deck became a bomb with a lit fuse, but we didn't think about it. We had done this drill hundreds of times. On the Akagi, the situation was even more complex. The ship carried Type 99 dive bombers that could carry either 250-kilogram general-purpose bombs or 242-kilogram semi-armor piercing bombs. The latter were for ships, the former for land targets. Crews had to not only change bombs, but change bomb types, each requiring different fuses and mounting brackets. At 7:28 a.m., as the frantic rearming continued, Tone's delayed scout plane finally reached its turn point. Pilot Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Amari was about to turn back when he spotted white wakes on the horizon. His radioed report was vague. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Admiral Nagumo received this message at 7:40 a.m. 10 ships could mean anything. Destroyers, transports, cruisers, nothing requiring the urgent attention of his carrier force. He continued the rearming for land attack while ordering the scout to ascertain ship types and maintain contact. At 7:55 a.m., Nagumo received a message that would later haunt him. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief flooded the bridge. Cruisers and destroyers, no carriers. The rearming could continue. Some officers even celebrated. Catching an American surface force without air cover would be excellent hunting. But at 8:09 a.m., another message arrived, this one correcting the previous report. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be one carrier bringing up the rear. The bridge of the Akagi erupted in controlled panic. A carrier, even one carrier, changed everything. Within seconds, Nagumo issued new orders. Suspend rearming. Leave torpedoes on aircraft that still have them. Prepare to launch ship attack immediately. But the situation below decks had passed the point of no return. Half the aircraft had bombs attached but not fused. Others had torpedoes partially mounted. Some were on the flight deck with bombs, others in the hangar with torpedoes. To launch a coordinated strike, all aircraft needed to be armed the same way. They needed at least 45 minutes to either complete the bomb conversion or return to torpedoes. The situation was actually worse than anyone knew. The returning Midway strike force was now approaching the carriers, low on fuel, many damaged, all needing to land immediately. Navy doctrine was absolute. You recovered your aircraft first, then launched new strikes. To do otherwise would mean losing dozens of aircraft and, more critically, their veteran pilots. At 8:30 a.m., Nagumo made his second fatal decision. Recover the Midway strike force first, then we will deal with the American carrier. From 8:37 a.m. to 9:17 a.m., all 4 Japanese carriers focused on recovering the Midway strike force. This operation, even under ideal circumstances, was complex. Clear the flight deck of aircraft, turn into the wind, recover aircraft in sequence, damaged aircraft first, then fighters, lowest fuel, then bombers, strike aircraft below immediately to clear deck space, refuel and rearm recovered aircraft, spot new aircraft for launch. What the Japanese didn't know was that time had already run out. At 7:02 a.m., Admiral Spruance on the Enterprise had made the most important decision of his career: launch everything immediately at maximum range without waiting to coordinate a proper strike. His air operations officer, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, had protested, "Admiral, we'll be launching at extreme range. Many planes won't make it back." Spruance's reply was prophetic. "We may lose planes, but if we catch them recovering their Midway strike, we'll catch them at their most vulnerable." The American carrier launch between 7:02 and 8:06 a.m. was barely controlled chaos that would have appalled Japanese naval aviation instructors. Instead of a coordinated strike package, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers arriving simultaneously, each squadron launched as soon as it was ready and proceeded independently. From Enterprise, 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers in 2 squadrons, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From Hornet, 35 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From Yorktown, launching 2 hours later, 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 6 F-4F Wildcat fighters. The launch was a disaster by Japanese standards. Squadrons became separated. Fighters flew at different altitudes from bombers. Radio discipline collapsed. Navigation errors sent entire squadrons in wrong directions. The Hornet's fighters and dive bombers never found the Japanese fleet at all, running out of fuel and ditching or returning to base. Ensign George Gay, torpedo bomber pilot from Hornet's VT-8 squadron, later described the scene. "We launched knowing we probably wouldn't make it back. Our squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Waldron, told us straight, 'We're going alone. We'll probably all be killed, but we're going to hit those carriers.' We flew off separately from our fighters and dive bombers. It was suicide, but it was also our job." At 9:18 a.m., just as the last Japanese aircraft from the Midway strike landed, radar on the Soryu detected incoming aircraft low on the water. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's VT-8 squadron, 15 obsolete torpedo bombers without fighter escort, had found the Japanese fleet through brilliant navigation and sheer determination. The massacre was complete. All 15 TBD Devastators were shot down. 29 of 30 aircrew were killed. Only Ensign Gay survived, hiding under his seat cushion in the water, watching what came next. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship, but the sacrifice, seemingly futile, had achieved something crucial. The Zeros had all descended to sea level to attack the torpedo bombers. The Japanese carriers had been forced into evasive maneuvers, unable to spot aircraft for launch. And most critically, the attention of every Japanese lookout was focused down at the water, not up at the sky. At 9:36 a.m., VT-6 from Enterprise arrived. 14 more torpedo bombers, also without escort. They too were massacred, losing 10 of 14 aircraft without scoring a hit. At 10 a.m., Yorktown's VT-3 arrived. 12 more torpedo bombers with a handful of fighters. They lost 10 of 12 aircraft, again scoring no hits. At 10:20 a.m., the last of the American torpedo bombers was either destroyed or fleeing. The Japanese carriers began recovering their Zeros, now low on ammunition and fuel from the slaughter. Victory seemed complete. Not a single torpedo had hit, and 35 of 41 American torpedo bombers had been destroyed. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo finally relaxed. His operations officer reported, "Sir, we can be ready to launch our strike against the American carrier in 30 minutes, all aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs." The flight decks of all 4 carriers were packed with aircraft. The Akagi had 40 aircraft on deck, fueled and armed. The Kaga had 30. The Soryu had 33. The Hiryu, further north, had 38. Fuel hoses were still connected to aircraft. Ordnance crews were making final adjustments to bomb and torpedo mountings. Pilots were in their cockpits, engines warming up. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky's Enterprise dive bombers had been flying in circles, searching for the Japanese fleet that wasn't where it was supposed to be. Low on fuel, McClusky had made a guess. Follow a Japanese destroyer he spotted racing northeast. That guess led him directly over the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. At 10:22 a.m., McClusky's 33 dive bombers pushed over into their dives from 14,500 feet. The Zeros were at sea level, refueling. The anti-aircraft guns were trained horizontally for torpedo defense. The decks were covered with aircraft, fuel and ordnance. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, selected the Akagi as his target. In his after-action report, he wrote, "The carrier was turning into the wind, her deck packed with aircraft." I could see crew running on the deck, fuel hoses being dropped, aircraft trying to start engines. They had maybe 60 seconds warning, not nearly enough. At 10:26 a.m., Best's 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the Akagi's flight deck near the midship elevator. It exploded in the hangar deck among torpedoes and bombs that had been removed from aircraft and stacked against all safety regulations in the hangar. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's squadron dove on the Kaga. 4 bombs hit the massive carrier in less than 30 seconds. The first bomb hit forward, destroying the bridge and killing Captain Jisaku Okada and his entire staff instantly. The subsequent bombs hit among the packed aircraft on deck. The induced explosions were catastrophic. The 80,000 tons of fuel, torpedoes and bombs aboard Kaga began exploding in sequence. Within minutes, the ship was an inferno from stem to stern. The heat was so intense that firefighting crews couldn't get within 50 feet of the flames. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers arrived at almost the same moment, targeting the Soryu. 3 1,000-pound bombs hit the carrier in a perfect line down the flight deck. The first exploded in the forward hangar, the second hit amidships among packed aircraft, the third destroyed the rear elevator. The Soryu had a particular vulnerability. She carried extra aviation fuel in tanks along the hangar deck sides to extend her aircraft range. These tanks ruptured immediately, creating a firestorm that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. At 10:31 a.m., as suddenly as it had begun, the American attack was over. McClusky's dive bombers were heading home, many running on fumes. In just 11 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed from the most powerful warships afloat into burning hulks. On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood in shock on the bridge as explosions rocked the ship beneath him. His operations officer, Commander Oishi, was shouting damage reports that seemed impossible. "Flight deck destroyed! Hangar deck in flames! All aircraft lost! Steering control lost! Communications destroyed!" Captain Taijiro Aoki grabbed Nagumo, who seemed paralyzed. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag. The ship is lost." On the Kaga, the situation was even worse. With the captain and senior officers killed in the first bomb hit, command devolved to the damage control officer, who was trapped below decks by fire. The Soryu was dying fastest. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused to leave his bridge even as flames approached. His final order, heard by several survivors, was, "Save yourselves." "I will remain with Soryu." He was last seen lashing himself to the helm, determined to go down with his ship. In the minutes following 10:31 a.m., the Japanese Navy faced a crisis beyond anything in their planning or experience. 3/4 of their carrier striking power had been eliminated in less time than it took to conduct a single landing operation. On the Hiryu, the only surviving carrier, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi watched in horror as smoke columns rose from his 3 sister ships. The mathematics were devastating. In 11 minutes, the Japanese had lost 3 fleet carriers, approximately 110 aircraft on deck, 40-plus aircraft in hangars, 50-plus aircraft aloft with nowhere to land, and would eventually lose over 2,000 skilled aircrew and maintenance personnel. The scene aboard the burning carriers defied description. On the Akagi, induced explosions continued for hours. Each explosion sent sheets of steel flying like scythes through compartments packed with men. The hangar deck became a crematorium. On the Kaga, the ship's size, she was a converted battleship, meant more compartments, more trapped men. The fires above made rescue impossible. The bulkheads were so hot they glowed. Hundreds died trapped in steel compartments. The Soryu's chief engineer, Commander Kondo, survived to describe the engine room catastrophe. The first bomb severed steam lines. Superheated steam at 400 degrees filled the compartments instantly. Men were literally steamed alive. Others suffocated as the fires consumed all oxygen. Admiral Yamaguchi on the Hiryu faced an impossible situation with characteristic aggression. Despite having only one carrier against 3 American ones, he immediately ordered a counterstrike. At 10:58 a.m., just 27 minutes after the American attack, Hiryu launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters. The strike found Yorktown at 12 p.m. Despite facing prepared defences and radar-directed fighter interception, the veterans pressed home their attack. 3 bombs hit Yorktown, starting fires and damaging her boilers. The American carrier slowed to a stop. Yamaguchi immediately ordered a second strike. At 1:31 p.m., 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros launched. This tiny force found Yorktown again at 2:42 p.m. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire that destroyed half the attackers, they put 2 torpedoes into Yorktown's port side. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the morning Midway strike, led this final attack. His plane had been damaged over Midway, its left-wing fuel tank holed. He knew he didn't have enough fuel to return, but launched anyway. His torpedo was one of the 2 that hit. His plane crashed into the sea immediately after, having run out of fuel. At 5:03 p.m., the inevitable occurred. 24 American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found Hiryu. 4 bombs turned the last Japanese carrier into another inferno. Captain Tomeo Kaku of the Hiryu, mortally wounded, gave his last order. Scuttle the ship. Save the crew. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard. His final message to his staff: I will apologize to the Emperor for the defeat. You will rebuild the Navy. As the Japanese carriers burned, the surviving officers began to understand the magnitude of their intelligence failure. The evidence was overwhelming in retrospect. American carriers at precisely the right position, Midway fully alerted and prepared, submarines positioned along Japanese approach routes, strike aircraft launched at maximum range at exactly the right time. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, operations officer of the combined fleet, would later write, We realized that the Americans had read our mail. Every message, every order, every plan. We had been performing for an audience that knew the script. The surprise we thought we possessed had actually belonged to them. Beyond the intelligence failure, the battle revealed fundamental truths about carrier warfare that the Japanese had not understood. Their entire doctrine, massed carrier operations, coordinated strikes, holding reserves, had been correct. But they had failed to execute it under pressure. The American dive bomber, the SBD Dauntless, had proved superior to the vaunted Japanese Val in the only metric that mattered: survivability while delivering ordnance. The American doctrine of deck-load strikes rather than hangar storage meant they could launch faster. The American damage control procedures, which the Japanese had mocked as overcautious, had already saved Yorktown once and would save other carriers throughout the war. As night fell on June 4th, thousands of Japanese sailors were in the water or crowded aboard destroyers. The 3 carriers were still afloat but burning, abandoned hulks on the horizon. Many Japanese sailors refused rescue, believing they had failed the Emperor. Men would swim away from rescue lines, shouting, "May the Emperor live 10,000 years," and then dive under, holding their breath until they drowned. What the Japanese didn't know was that the Americans believed they were losing even as they won. Admiral Spruance, receiving reports of his missing squadrons, calculated he had lost over half his aircraft. Yorktown was crippled and listing. Japanese submarines were reported everywhere. Spruance's decision to continue the engagement despite uncertainty would prove crucial. His scouts found the burning Japanese carriers that evening, confirming the magnitude of the victory. But even then, the Americans didn't fully understand what they had achieved. June 5th brought cruel confirmation of American fears and Japanese disaster. The submarine I-168, dispatched by Yamamoto, found Yorktown under tow, barely moving. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes. 2 hit Yorktown, 1 hit the destroyer Hammond alongside. Yorktown would sink on June 7th, the last carrier lost at Midway. But by then, the outcome was decided. The 4 Japanese carriers were gone, scuttled by their own destroyers when it became clear they couldn't be saved. The human cost of those 11 minutes continued to mount for days. The Akagi was scuttled at 5 a.m. on June 5th after burning for 19 hours. The Kaga sank at 7:25 p.m. on June 4th, taking 811 men with her. The Soryu went under at 7:13 p.m. on June 4th with 711 souls. The Hiryu lingered until 9 a.m. on June 5th before disappearing beneath the waves with 392 men. The total Japanese death toll from the 4 carriers was 2,181, but these weren't just sailors. They were the experienced mechanics who could service complex aircraft engines, the armourers who could mount torpedoes in minutes, the fuel handlers who could conduct underway replenishment, the veteran pilots who had conquered half the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the battleship Yamato 300 miles behind the carrier force, received the reports in silence. His staff officer, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, described the scene. The Admiral sat completely still for nearly an hour after learning of the 4th carrier's loss. Then he said quietly, "The war is over. We will fight on, but the war is over." Yamamoto understood what others would take months to grasp. Japan had started the war with 10 fleet and light carriers. In 6 months they had lost 5. They could build new carriers, and they would, but they couldn't replace the trained crews. A carrier pilot required 2 years of training. A qualified aircraft mechanic needed 18 months. A flight deck crew needed 6 months of intensive drilling to operate efficiently. The mathematics were inexorable. America had launched 17 new carriers by the time Japan managed to commission 1. American pilot training programs were producing 10,000 pilots per month by 1943. Japan never exceeded 500 per month and couldn't replace losses. The survivors of Midway carried psychological scars that affected the entire Japanese Navy. The myth of invincibility was shattered. The confidence that had driven operations from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon evaporated in 11 minutes of dive bomber attacks. The Japanese Navy instituted new procedures based on Midway's lessons. Combat air patrol always retained at altitude, decks kept clear unless immediately launching, ordnance returned to magazines immediately, multiple search patterns overlapping, radio silence abandoned for tactical communication. But these changes came too late and addressed the symptoms, not the cause. The cause was that American intelligence, production, and innovation had already surpassed Japan. For the Americans, those 11 minutes created a different transformation, from desperate defenders to confident aggressors. The Pacific Fleet, traumatized by Pearl Harbor, had discovered it could not just fight the Japanese Navy but destroy it. Admiral Nimitz, receiving confirmation of the victory, told his staff, "They are not supermen. They can be beaten. They have been beaten. Now we take the offensive." The tactical lessons were immediately incorporated. Dive bombers were supreme ship killers, coordinated strikes were ideal but not essential. First strike advantage was decisive. Radar-directed fighter control was crucial. Damage control could save seemingly doomed ships. But the most important lesson was psychological. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Hornet's VT-8, who had floated in the water watching the Japanese carriers burn, put it simply. "We had stood up to the best they had and destroyed it. After that, we knew we would win the war. It was just a matter of time and blood." Post-war analysis revealed the precise sequence of those 11 minutes in devastating detail. American dive bombers had achieved approximately 52% hit rates at Midway, far above normal training statistics. They had achieved them at the perfect moment. The Japanese had shot down 35 of 41 torpedo bombers, an 85% kill rate, but those sacrificial attacks had created the conditions for the dive bombers' success. The Japanese carriers had been caught in what naval theorists call the vulnerable window, that moment when a carrier is most helpless. Aircraft being serviced preventing defensive manoeuvres, fuel lines connected making fire inevitable, ordnance exposed multiplying any damage, attention focused elsewhere preventing early detection. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the intelligence officer whose codebreakers had made the ambush possible, observed, "We won because we knew when they would be vulnerable, and we were lucky enough to catch them exactly then. 5 minutes earlier or later, and the battle ends differently." Today, the wrecks of the Japanese carriers lie in Midway's deep waters, war graves for thousands. Oceanographer Robert Ballard's expeditions have found Yorktown at 16,650 feet and Kaga at 17,700 feet, their hulks testimonies to those 11 minutes. Recent expeditions in 2023 have provided detailed surveys of these wrecks, now protected within the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. Survivors established memorials on both sides. At commemorations, former enemies met as friends, united in recognition of a battle that changed history. The Japanese Navy's attempt to hide Midway's outcome from its own people, quarantining survivors, swearing them to secrecy, claiming victory while hiding defeat, corroded morale throughout the fleet and set a pattern of deception that would continue until war's end. Historians have endlessly debated how different those 11 minutes might have been. If Tone's Scout had launched on time, though paradoxically, modern research shows the delay actually helped the Japanese discover the Americans earlier than they would have otherwise. If Nagumo had kept a reserve strike, if the American torpedo bombers hadn't attacked, if McClusky hadn't followed that destroyer. But history has no alternative timelines. What happened in those 11 minutes changed everything. Modern military strategists still study Midway for lessons applicable to contemporary conflict. Information dominance remains decisive. First strike advantage in high-technology warfare usually determines outcomes. All military systems have moments of maximum vulnerability. Individual decisions under pressure still determine outcomes. Better systems defeat better warriors. In letters, diaries, and interviews collected over decades, survivors painted intimate portraits of those 11 minutes. American and Japanese accounts converge on the chaos, the heroism, the terror, and the transformation that occurred in those decisive moments. The U.S. Naval War College's analysis concludes, Midway's 11 minutes remain the gold standard for decisive military action. Never before or since has such a small window of time so completely reversed strategic reality. Economic historians calculate that those 11 minutes cost Japan approximately 2 billion yen in 1942 values, roughly 15% of Japan's annual military budget. But the indirect costs were far greater. Pilot training programs accelerated, reducing quality. Resources diverted from other projects to replace carriers. Industrial capacity strained beyond sustainable limits. Technical development rushed, leading to design flaws. America, conversely, found its war economy vindicated. The carriers lost at Midway were replaced within months. The industrial machine that had seemed impossible to Japanese observers was just warming up. In Japanese culture, Midway became a metaphor for nemesis, the moment when hubris meets reality. The term Midway syndrome entered Japanese business vocabulary, describing overconfidence leading to catastrophic failure. Japanese Admiral Tanaka Raizo, writing after the war, observed, "Those 11 minutes taught Japan that the age of the samurai was over. Individual courage, skill, and dedication meant nothing against systematic intelligence, overwhelming production, and technological superiority. We entered those 11 minutes as warriors. We emerged as anachronisms." Survivors from both sides carried unique psychological burdens. American dive bomber pilots who had delivered death in those 11 minutes often suffered survivor's guilt. Japanese sailors who lived through the inferno faced shame for surviving when their ships died. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose bomb destroyed Akagi, never flew again due to tuberculosis activated by breathing caustic soda from his aircraft's oxygen system. He spent decades wondering about the men he killed with that one perfectly placed bomb. "I did my duty," he said in 1995, "but duty doesn't ease the knowledge that my success meant death for hundreds of men doing their duty." Modern computer simulations have recreated those 11 minutes with precise detail, revealing how narrow the margin was. If the American dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes later, Japanese combat air patrol would have been refueled and at altitude. If they had arrived 10 minutes earlier, Japanese decks wouldn't have been full of aircraft. If cloud cover had been 500 feet lower, the dive bombers couldn't have attacked. If wind direction had been different, carriers couldn't have launched or recovered aircraft. The simulation conclusion. Those 11 minutes represented the only window in a 2-hour period when the Japanese carriers were catastrophically vulnerable. The Americans hit that window perfectly. Military doctrine worldwide changed based on those 11 minutes. Carriers began operating in dispersed formations rather than concentrated groups. Combat air patrols maintained multiple altitude layers continuously. Deck load strikes became standard, minimizing hangar exposure. Damage control became equally important as offensive capability. Intelligence gathering received equal priority with operations. The US Navy completely rewrote its carrier warfare manual based on Midway's lessons. The Japanese Navy couldn't afford to implement the changes their analysis recommended. They lacked the resources to maintain constant air patrol or rapid rearmament capability. Ultimately, those 11 minutes came down to individual human decisions made under extreme pressure. McClusky's decision to follow the destroyer, Best's split-second choice of targets, Nagumo's fateful order to rearm, Spruance's calculated risk to launch at maximum range, individual pilots pressing attacks despite certain death. Admiral Spruance later reflected, "We won because our mistakes were recoverable, and theirs were not." In those 11 minutes, every Japanese mistake was magnified, every American gamble paid off. It wasn't justice or destiny. It was probability finally catching up with risk. At the 75th anniversary of Midway in 2017, the last surviving participants spoke at the commemoration. Their words captured the weight of those 11 minutes that had defined the rest of the 20th century. History remembers those 11 minutes as both glory and necessary horror. They defined not just a battle, but an era, proving that in modern warfare, advantage can shift instantly and irreversibly. They demonstrated that intelligence, technology, and industrial capacity matter more than tradition, training, and tactical superiority. They showed that individual decisions at crucial moments can outweigh years of preparation. Between 10:20 and 10:31 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the trajectory of human history shifted. 3 Japanese carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, the instruments of Pacific conquest, the symbols of Japanese power, were transformed into burning wrecks. The American aircraft launched in desperate, uncoordinated attacks had achieved what seemed impossible, decisive victory against a superior force. Those 11 minutes proved that in modern warfare, advantage can shift instantly and irreversibly. They demonstrated that intelligence, technology, and industrial capacity matter more than tradition, training, and tactical superiority. They showed that individual decisions at crucial moments can outweigh years of preparation. The Japanese pilots who had ruled Pacific skies for 6 months discovered in 11 minutes that their dominance was an illusion built on temporary advantage. The American pilots who had been dismissed as inferior discovered they could destroy the world's best naval force when circumstances aligned. In those 11 minutes, 2,181 Japanese sailors and airmen would eventually die on the 4 carriers, joining 307 Americans in transforming abstract strategic concepts into human tragedy. Their sacrifice, willing and unwilling, victorious and defeated, created the pivot point around which the Pacific War turned. The carriers that sank took with them not just steel and fuel and ammunition, but dreams of empire, assumptions of superiority, and confidence in destiny. They left behind widows who would never know how their husbands died, children who would grow up without fathers, and nations forced to confront the difference between mythology and reality. Today, the Pacific Ocean flows peacefully over the graves of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Yorktown rests nearby, American and Japanese wrecks sharing the same dark waters. They remain there as monuments to those 11 minutes when the future was forged in falling bombs and rising flames, when young men died for causes they believed in, and when the modern world was born in violence that seemed endless but lasted less time than a coffee break. Those 11 minutes stand as history's most compressed lesson in the futility of military hubris, the power of intelligence and innovation, and the terrible cost of strategic miscalculation. They remind us that in warfare, as in life, everything can change in moments, that superiority is always temporary, and that the price of error is paid in blood. The last word belongs to Admiral Nagumo, who survived those 11 minutes but never recovered from them. Before his death on Saipan in 1944, he wrote, "At Midway, we learned that wars are not won by warriors but by systems. In 11 minutes, the American system destroyed our warrior tradition. We thought we were fighting the last war better. They were fighting the next war first. Those 11 minutes were not a battle. They were an execution of obsolescence by innovation." The American aircraft launched while Japanese pilots had those 11 minutes changed more than the Pacific War. They changed how humanity would fight, think about, and remember conflict. In those 11 minutes, the age of the warrior ended and the age of the technologist began. The world has never been the same.